We need to talk about Dan Gertler, because he's an Israeli billionaire that's been accused of looting Congo at the expense of its people, and he stands to make millions out of a deal with the U.S. government. And notably, this is a guy who in 2017, he was sanctioned by the U.S. government for corrupt business practices in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, the Biden administration has pitched Gertler a plan to ease sanctions on him in exchange for a permanent exit from the country, with that exit being facilitated through the sale of Gertler's remaining assets in the DRC. Asset sales that could potentially hand him tens of millions of dollars. But this whole story is also more than it seems on the surface, and it really raises real questions about if and how compromises should be made when efforts to hold individuals accountable for wrongdoing collide with the political and economic interests of a country or the people of that country. So with that, buckle in and let's start at the beginning. So here's what you need to know about Dan Gertler. For one, mining is a family business, right? He is the grandson of a man who has been considered one of the founding fathers of the Israeli diamond industry. And in 1997, in his early 20s, Gertler went to the Congo to make his own name in the diamond trade. It was there that he struck up a friendship with Joseph Kabila, the son of the man who, in that same year, overthrew the country's previous leader, ending a civil war and becoming the leader of the newly formed Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC. When a second war soon broke out, Gertler placed his bet on another Kabila victory, with him in the year 2000 allegedly promising the family millions of dollars as well as access to weapons in exchange for a monopoly on the DRC's diamond exports. And from there, that deal and Gertler's close ties to the regime, it helped him single-handedly become one of the biggest holders of mining rights in the country. But also, crucially, Gertler didn't make his wealth from diamonds alone, because the DRC is also home to around 50% of the world's cobalt reserves. Cobalt, that's one of the most important materials in the world, right? And that's because it's used to make lithium-ion batteries found in items such as electric vehicles, computers, smartphones, even e-cigs. So with that, the cobalt industry is linked to widespread human rights abuses, including child labor. And I'll get more into that in a bit, but for now, just know that the growth of the cobalt industry, it almost perfectly coincided with Gertler's entry into the DRC. But from 2000 through 2020, cobalt demand specifically for the manufacturing of batteries grew 26-fold. And notably, 82% of this growth occurred in China. So with that, Chinese companies own or have a major stake in the majority of cobalt-producing sites in Congo. On the other hand, the last large American mining company in the DRC pulled out of the country in 2020, just as electric vehicles were really taking off. So with all this, Gertler's mines are the biggest non-Chinese sources of cobalt on Earth. In total, they produce nearly 30% of the world's supply of cobalt. They're also major sources of copper, and notably, demand for both of these materials, it's not going anywhere. Although it is hoped that cobalt-free batteries could power cars of the future, with Tesla already using cobalt-free batteries in many of its vehicles. And all of that, it brings us back to Gertler, because it was in 2017 that the US government hit Gertler with sanctions, placing him on a list of human rights abusers and corrupt actors across the globe. Though notably, it didn't actually have to do with his blood diamonds in the Second Congo War, a conflict which, by the way, resulted in an estimated 3 million deaths, making it far and away the deadliest war of the 21st century. And similarly, it didn't have to do with the allegations of human rights abuses at the mining sites linked to companies that Gertler had a stake in. Instead, specifically, the Treasury Department targeted Gertler for amassing, quote, his fortune through hundreds of millions of dollars worth of opaque and corrupt mining and oil deals in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with all of that having to do with his friendship with Joseph Kabila, with Treasury explaining that Gertler acted as a middleman for mining asset sales in the DRC. So basically, if you wanted to do business in the Congo, you had to go through Gertler. And with that, between 2010 and 2012 alone, the DRC reportedly lost over $1.36 billion in revenues from the underpricing of mining assets that were sold to offshore companies linked to Gertler. With that, I should note that Gertler has never been charged with the crime and denies any wrongdoing. So after the sanctions, he hired a legal and lobbying team to make his case to the Trump administration, with him, interestingly enough, hiring Alan Dershowitz, the infamous lawyer who served on the legal teams of O.J. Simpson, Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, and Donald Trump himself. And that's in addition to hiring the same lawyer used by Israeli PM Bibi Netanyahu to fight off corruption charges that he faced in Israel. Actually, with that, Israeli officials were among those who argued to the Trump administration on Gertler's behalf, with them reportedly claiming he was a, quote, vital national security asset. And it paid off. In Trump's final week of office, his administration quietly eased the sanctions on Gertler with almost no public notice. So notably there, a Times investigation found that the decision defied Treasury Department norms, with one former high-ranking official saying it appeared to be an abuse of the process. But in any case, it ended up being no surprise when Biden came in and almost immediately reimposed sanctions on Gertler, with the State Department issuing a statement saying the previous decision was inconsistent with America's strong foreign policy interests in combating corruption around the world. Which then brings us to the big question of, well, what has changed, right? Why is Biden now prepared to go back on that? Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that Biden has not yet actually eased sanctions. Right? At this point, it is just an offer. Unlike what happened under Trump, there are strings attached. Basically, the proposed deal would give Gertler a license to sell off his remaining stakes in his 3 major copper and cobalt mining operations in Congo. But as mentioned, he would also still make money off those sales. With that, he would also be required to release a detailed statement of any remaining holdings in Congo, which would then be examined by an independent auditor. And eventually, Gertler could get a license to allow him access to the U.S. financial system. And all of this, while technically he wouldn't be dropped from the the list of sanctioned individuals, but he would remain on that list even though he could operate with a waiver. The banks would be allowed to do business with him, but there would be some extra steps. And if Gertler violated any of the conditions, if undisclosed assets were found, or if he continued to operate in Congo, the waiver would be dropped right away. So with all that said, the hope from the Biden administration is that this deal would make Western-leaning companies more willing to invest in Congo. And in turn, that would increase the supply of cobalt to the United States as automakers race to increase domestic production of batteries. And to that point, two senior Biden administration officials reportedly told the New York Times that Western firms would continue to avoid investing in the Congo mining sector as long as Gertler remained involved. And actually, as of now, no major American mining company has publicly disclosed a plan to reinvest in Congo. And this is the government has been stepping up its own involvement in the region. Right? I mean, last year, for example, the U.S. signs an agreement to, quote, facilitate the development of an integrated value chain for the production of electric vehicle batteries in the DRC and Zambia. With all of this, of course, being not only about keeping in line with the administration's policy positions that embrace alternative energy solutions to fossil fuels, but also about addressing what it sees as a competitive disadvantage with China, especially when it comes to electric vehicles, which is also the justification for the new tariffs going into effect on imports of Chinese goods, including EVs. And on that front, the U.S. is also helping finance the $2.3 billion Libido Corridor rail project, which is a big deal because it'll link Congo and Zambia to the Atlantic Ocean. And the aim being to allow cobalt and copper mines in those countries to more directly supply battery manufacturing plants in the U.S. or allied countries. And this, while at the same time, China is now announcing plans to spend $1 billion on its own railway project to connect the DRC to a port on the other side of the continent. Though, of course, with all of this, there are many that feel that the competition with China, it doesn't justify letting Gertler off the hook. And in fact, some state and Treasury Department officials reportedly oppose the decision, with them arguing that Gertler shouldn't be allowed to keep profiting off of his wrongdoing. And a bipartisan group of lawmakers, including one Democrat and one Republican from both the House and Senate, have also denounced the plan, with them claiming that the conditions for lifting sanctions haven't been met, and also writing, we fear that if sanctions are removed, Mr. Gertler will profit massively off his ill-gotten assets to the detriment of the Congolese people. Such an event would significantly undermine efforts to combat transnational corruption and U.S. foreign policy and national security interests. And then finally, human rights groups have, of course, opposed the decision as well. The letter from more than a dozen Congolese and international civil society organizations again claiming any agreement that would allow Mr. Gertler to continue to profit from the corrupt activity for which he was sanctioned in the first place would undermine the credibility and integrity of U.S. sanctions. And further warning that this would set a precedent of rewarding actors who have not shown a significant change in behavior while continuing to harm the people that the sanctions were intended to help. But also with all of that, no one is opposed to having Gertler get rid of his remaining financial stakes in Congo. It's just that they think that he should be forced to simply forfeit them. But the Biden administration says that expectation is just unrealistic. Because Gertler, I mean, he's already earning royalty payments, so he wouldn't be willing to just walk away from his investments without compensation. And it's not like a little money. 2021, a Congolese group estimated that Gertler earns an average of more than $254,000 per day from the royalty payments, with them projecting that he'll have netted nearly $2 billion by 2039. So the reality of the situation at the end of the day is that Gertler is making money either way. So that's why there's actually support for the deal from within the DRC as well, including the DRC's current president, who said in a letter to Biden, the Democratic Republic of Congo no longer has any grievances against Mr. Gertler and his group. And going further to say that the sanctions have the potential to lead to the disappearance of foreign direct investment in Congo. Though also notably, he only agreed to lobby for Gertler after reaching his own deal with a billionaire in 2022, which we saw Gertler agree to return to Congo an estimated $2 billion worth of mining and oil drilling rights secured over the past 2 decades. But even with that said, several Congo-based civil society groups have supported the easing of sanctions as well, with one group that actually called for sanctions against Gertler in the past saying in a letter now that the sanctions have served their purpose, by claiming that they helped create the conditions for the first peaceful transition of power in the country's history. But that now the sanctions have created a vacuum being filled by authoritarian states like China and Russia, who notably, the group says, have contributed to the broader regression of labor rights and free enterprise. And so with that, the US and DRC reportedly both hope that this deal, by getting Gertler out of the country, would improve labor and environmental standards, as well as, allow Congo to root out corruption and benefit more from its mining industry. And to that point, the Biden administration has invested millions of dollars in grants and technical assistance to help enforce labor laws in the country. But notably, at the same time, the West doesn't exactly have a great track record in the DRC either, with that including Western companies linked to Gertler. And again, Gertler hasn't been found guilty of any crime. It's just, let's say, it's hard to imagine someone building a mining empire in the DRC without having blood on their hands. Like, for example, much of Gertler's business has been with a Swiss company by the name of Glencore. They first partnered in 2007, and now Glencore is the primary owner of 2 of the 3 mining operations that Gertler is still cashing in on, with the Business and Human Rights Center, which tracks human rights abuses related to the global energy transition, reporting that Glencore has the worst human rights record of any company it it follows. Also in 2022, Glencore actually pleaded guilty in the US to bribery, corruption, and market manipulation, paying $1.1 billion in fines to settle the charges. But Glencore also named it a lawsuit that's against Apple, Alphabet, Dell, Microsoft, and Tesla, that accusing the tech companies of knowingly benefiting from and aiding and abetting the cruel and brutal use of young children in the Democratic Republic of Congo to mine cobalt, with that lawsuit detailing allegations of forced child labor at Glencore-owned cobalt sites in the DRC. And again, it includes those linked to Gertler. Now, in the end there, a U.S. court effectively absolved the tech companies of responsibility, with the court decision saying that they do not have anything more than an ordinary buyer-seller transaction with suppliers in the DRC. But Glencore was not the defendant in that specific case, and there notably was no denial from the judge in his ruling that child labor had occurred. So while individuals like Gertler and companies like Glencore continue to avoid any real justice, the question unfortunately becomes whether the people of the DRC will pay more or less of a price by these sanctions remaining in place or not. We're kind of just left hoping that one day maybe real justice can be served.